right, good afternoon, everyone. So before we get started today, I just wanted to draw your attention to an announcement that went up. So this is just the details for our second midterm. So we've kind of hinted at the fact that now that we're back to in-person, things are going to move a little bit differently. We're going to be doing the midterm in class like we had intended with the first one before we were sent online for that 2-week window. So our second midterm will be in here on Monday, November 1st. So that's next Monday. Oh, I'm on the wrong class. Right info, wrong time. Sorry. I keep doing that. There we go. Same exact announcement, except now the date and time makes sense. There we go. Same day. This room, 1 to 1:50, so same 50-minute window. It's still going to be open book, but this time, because I know not everyone has a laptop that they can sort of drag around with them, we're going to restrict it to sort of physical copies. So my suggestion is, like, you can bring in your textbook and all of your class notes if you would like, but for saving yourself some time and also helping yourself study, I would recommend putting together like a 1 or 2 page cheat sheet, which has all those important definitions that you might have, just so that you can have them handy so you can look stuff up as you go. For the same reason that our online stuff was a little bit tighter on time, I'm going to do not quite as tight because we are in person, so I'll have 35 multiple choice questions instead of the 40 that we had used online, and then still 5 short answer questions. But it's going to be the same basic setup, just in person rather than on eClass. So I will have to figure out how to print exams. I haven't done that before, but once I figure that out, we'll have the exams and some sort of bubble sheets to fill out, and then we'll be golden. And so it's going to be on the chapters that we've covered since that first midterm, so 4, 5, and 6. So it's going to include everything up until Friday, but as I've kind of hinted, we should be finished with new content on Wednesday, and then I'm intending to use Friday to talk about sort of a practical application of operant conditioning, and actually mentioning how I do research that involves sort of operant discrimination tasks in chickadees. So it will be sort of an interesting class, I hope, giving you sort of a practical application of operant conditioning, but it won't be a ton of new information that you'll have to learn, just so I'm not throwing too much at you right before the exam. And then that should finish up with enough time that we can have questions if you have any. So I think that was everything. All of that's in the announcement that would have gone out this morning, so you should have sort of an email notification about that, but I just wanted to run through it in person while I have you all here for it. Okay, any questions on that before we move on? No? All right. Perfect. Okay, so today, we're going to start talking about behavior event learning, which is our other way of talking about instrumental or operant conditioning. So we started off with our event alone learning. That was habituation. That's where we had sort of a single stimulus, a single event, and we learned something about the occurrence of that event. Then we went to event learning. That was our classical conditioning, and we learned an association between 2 separate stimuli. And now we're into behavior event learning, and as you're going to see, it involves some kind of behavior or action and a event or a stimulus or an outcome that follows. So that's why we're talking about this as behavior event learning. But for our official definition, we can have operant or instrumental conditioning is learning that's controlled by the consequences of an organism's behavior. So the consequences, that outcome after you do an action, is what's driving what we learn in this situation. And so we're going to see this idea of a stimulus and a response and an outcome also with some other names introduced later on, but the idea is that we have some kind of stimulus or event that sets an occasion. It allows us to know that we're supposed to make a response. We will then make a response. Mostly we're going to talk about pushing a lever or a button or something like that. And then there's some kind of outcome after we've done that behavior. And then we're going to talk about what makes us more or less likely to perform a particular behavior. And so this all got started because of Edward Thorndike and his law of effect. So you might remember Thorndike as a behaviorist. So they were really focusing in on environmental control of behavior through the process of learning, which makes sense because now we're going to be looking at how sort of interacting with our environment, how doing a particular action in our environment will lead to particular outcomes. And so the law of effect specifically states that if a response in the presence of a stimulus is followed by a satisfying state of affairs, the bond between stimulus and response will be strengthened. So if we hop back here, we're saying that there's some sort of stimulus at the beginning, something that lets us know that we should make a response. We will make a particular response, and if the outcome is good or satisfying, then we've strengthened the relationship between these actions here. So the next time we see that particular stimulus, the next time the situation is the same, we're going to be more likely to perform that particular response again. So we can call this sort of increase in association, that strengthening of that relationship, stamping in a response, making it more likely to occur. Whereas, not stated in this quote here, but it continues on to say that if it's followed by a dissatisfying situation, or if we're uncomfortable in the outcome, then we're going to be less likely to perform that action again. So that would be stamping out. So if it's a bad outcome, so maybe you swear in front of a parent and they yell at you. That's a bad outcome. So you should probably be less likely to swear in front of them again. So the stimulus, that situation, would be your parent being there, and the behavior would be swearing, and then the outcome is they get mad at you. So if your parents are around, maybe you won't do that in the future. So we stamp out those associations where you learn that when your parents are around, maybe we don't do that behavior. And so this whole process was set up because Thorndike was obsessed with what he called his puzzle boxes. And so there's an example of one such puzzle box there. And these were basically just boxes with complex escape routes. So hungry cats would be placed in these boxes, and they had to push buttons, pull levers, move cords, do all sorts of strange things that cats would not normally do in order to escape from that box. And so each of these actions sort of rolled together into a puzzle to escape, hence puzzle box. And the idea here was that if the cat escapes, they would then get access to food or milk, which are also satisfying outcomes, especially when the cats are hungry. So it's some kind of motivation for them to leave the box as quickly as possible. And the faster they escape, the quicker they get access to that food. So we're kind of giving them an incentive to get out as fast as they can. And so when what Thorndike was trying to do specifically was actually tell the difference between two possibilities. And I'm going to hop back and forth between two slides here. But this diagram here actually shows the two possibilities. At the time, a lot of people were talking about the concept of insight, which was basically that organisms would have sort of an aha moment where they weren't sure how to do it, and then all of a sudden it would occur to them, they would have insight into the problem, and then they would carry out their solution. And so what that would look like, if we focus on the line that has the triangles, for our axes, actually, before we even look at the lines, along the bottom is just successive trials, so that's our time variable on the x, and then y is time to solution or how long it takes them to escape. So the higher they are on that y-axis, the longer they're stuck in the box. So if it's nice and low on that y-axis, then they've learned how to escape very quickly. And so then now we can go back to the triangle line and we would see that they take a long time, they take a long time, they take a long time. And then about halfway through, they would have that aha moment. They would have that insight where suddenly they've figured it out and all of a sudden they go from taking forever to escape to getting out right away. So that's what he would expect if there was insight or non-incremental improvement in performance, meaning that they went from not understanding it to understanding it completely. What Thorndike was actually looking for was incremental improvement in performance, basically a slow process of learning. And if that was the case, then he would see something like our circle line, where at the top, or at the beginning, we would have, it takes a long time, but gradually the cats would figure it out. They'd take slower and slower and slower, I guess they get out faster and faster is the best way to say that. So eventually, they would go from taking like the full amount of time, possibly needing to be rescued, to figuring it out just as quickly as those insightful cats might have. And this would be through, say, trial and error. And this is where Thorndike's theory came into place, where if a particular action was followed by a good outcome, like getting out of the box and getting access to food, then they'd be more likely to do it in the future. And so they should theoretically repeat those good behaviors, the ones that got them out of the box, and eventually they'd learn to do all of the good behaviors all together, and they'd learn to get out very quickly. So we'd see more of a gradual or incremental improvement in their approach. And so what we actually see, though it's a little bit messier here because this is real data instead of theoretical data, in this diagram, same thing, trials or time on the bottom, and then how long it takes them to escape on the y-axis. We see that at the beginning it takes on average longer, and as time goes on, it takes on average less time. So he got evidence for his incremental improvements, and that tells us that they're a lot more like trial and error with reinforcement or strengthening of bonds with those actions that get them out sooner. So that's what got us started here. And the process that he used to do this, the Thorndike's puzzle boxes, actually led to the initial name for this type of learning, which was the instrumental learning, because the cats were using instruments like foot pedals and levers in order to escape. So that's why instrumental learning is still a fairly common title for this type of learning. But it did evolve and change a little bit, and now we call it, well, I call it operant learning or operant conditioning. And that came from Skinner, who sort of added on to what Thorndike had done. He was very inspired by that concept of that incremental improvement, but he wanted to apply it sort of to absolutely everything, not just figuring out how to get out of a box. So either of them are fine, operant or instrumental, but I do see operant just a little bit more often. And so we've already talked about Skinner, specifically calling him a radical behaviorist. So if Thorndike was just a plain old behaviorist, Skinner took it to an extreme. So Skinner was the one who said that any human behavior that you could observe, he could make it such that we learned that behavior through operant conditioning. It was all controlled by interactions with our environment, and that the human mind had nothing to do with the things that we did. A pretty aggressive point to take. But he was responsible for identifying a lot of the key processes that take place during operant conditioning. And he did many, many, many studies that helped us kind of pick apart what's going on at different stages of learning. And so specifically, we're going to talk about one of the major tools used in operant conditioning, even to this day. And this is the Skinner box, which you can also call an operant chamber. So I will probably call it an operant chamber, just again, because that's what I have heard it as the most. When we worked with the birds doing operant conditioning, we talked about the operant chambers. We didn't call them Skinner boxes. So, but the base setup for all of these, no matter what species you're working with, whether it be rats or pigeons or chickadees or even humans, you're going to have the same basic setup, more or less. So at the bottom here, we have a box, which, okay, we got that from the name. But in that box, we have a couple of unique factors. This one here has two colored lights. So we have a red light and a green light. Those could be telling us something about what's going on. Those could be those stimuli at the beginning that tell us what behavior we should or should not be performing. We also have a bar or a lever there for the rat to push. Sometimes you'll see a button, sometimes we'll use touch screens so that you can peck directly on a screen. There's all sorts of different options here, but there's some kind of operant response, some kind of behavior that you can make that we would then be able to measure and observe. We also have access to water. Most of these operant chambers have free access to water because it's really important to have access to water. We then also have access to food, and food is almost always set up as our positive reinforcement here, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But we would say when the rat pushes the bar at the correct time, they would receive food. So they only get food when they do the correct action at the correct time. For most operant setups, they're usually run for very short windows. I know with pigeons, they only run them for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. Mostly because they eat so much during that period that you can't keep running them. They get bored and start doing random things in the boxes. So during that case, you're like, okay, well, we know how much they ate, and then they go back to their cages and they have free access to food, not to worry. With the chickadees, we had them in the boxes all the time because with a pigeon, you can just sort of pick them up and you actually carry them around in like a juice jug, like what you'd mix Kool-Aid or whatever in. If you put them in head first, it holds their wings nice and close against their body so they can't get loose. At least that's the theory. I have seen enough pigeons loose in the halls to know that that doesn't always work. But it was nothing to see sort of an undergrad run around with like 6 juice pitchers full of pigeons, because that is the most efficient way to move them. But they don't mind being handled. You can pick them up, you can put them down, they're fine. With the chickadees, they will fight you tooth and nail, and they do not want to be touched, they don't want to be looked at, they don't want to know that you're there. So we would put them in the operant boxes and leave them and like sort of check on them once or twice a day, but not interfere with them enough to stress them out, because with most very small birds, they'll just sort of keel over from stress. So we left them in the boxes much longer, but had to take precautions to make sure they were eating enough. So in most studies, it doesn't matter because they go right back and get full access to food. If you keep them longer, we watch them for a lot longer times and make sure that they have a good access to food. So we'd give them free food if they ever sort of slowed down on their participation. But that's just a little bit of a tangent to explain the ethics of these boxes, because I've had some students with questions in the past, and it is a weird setup to think of if you've never seen them before. So a little bit more than we needed there, but that's how that works. And then the important part here, I guess important for researchers who didn't want to sit there and stare at these animals and their responses, you can set up something that would record the actions of the animal in the box. Nowadays, it's no big deal. You could stick a video camera with sort of software that'll automatically recognize certain behaviors. But at the time, they had something as simple as when the rat presses the bar down, it would make a line on a rolling chart, so you could tell at what time the bar had been pressed. So that would track sort of when they've made a response, if they got reinforcement from that response, and so on. So it's really useful because then not only do you not have to sit there and stare at them for the whole time, but you could run multiple animals at once, which as a researcher is a much better option than, say, what Thorndike was doing, where he would sit a box with a cat in it on his table and watch it until it escaped. So this is a big revolution in the field and allowed a lot of advancement in our understanding of learning. Okay, So next is when we introduce some terms, and these are Skinner's preferred terms. We can use them interchangeably or alongside what we've talked about already. But we can start off with an antecedent, which is something that's detectable in our environment that sets the occasion to respond. So this is something that tells us that if we did a particular action, we might get a particular outcome. So in our operant boxes, we typically use what's called a cue light, which is just a little red light that says, hey, if you sort of do an action right now, you would initiate a trial. When that cue light is off, at least the chickadees would know that if you do anything right now, there's nothing that's going to happen because the system's in standby. So you can't start behaving or your behaviors don't matter until we've set the occasion for you to behave. So until that cue light is on, there's no point in pressing that lever or pushing that button because it won't mean anything until we're ready to go. This could also be the antecedent being, say, your mother present if you're deciding to swear or not. So it's something that you can detect and lets you know sort of what to expect coming forward. And I'm going to actually hop again between slides here. And same basic setup as before, where we talked about a stimulus, a response, and an outcome. Our antecedent is that stimulus at the beginning. So sometimes we'll talk about that original or starting stimulus. Sometimes we'll talk about an antecedent. Both are referring to the same idea. So these are just alternate terms for the same basic concepts. Next is our behavior or our response. So this is an activity that can be repeated, measured, and has some kind of impact on the environment. So this is that pressing the lever. So we're doing an action, we can observe that action, we can record it with our Skinner box, and by doing that action, they might end up triggering that outcome of getting food. Or maybe they don't. Maybe they just push it and nothing happens. And then consequences are stimuli or events that can increase or decrease the probability of a behavior occurring in the future. Those are our outcomes, so we can also call them consequences. So this is just meant to show you that same basic concept, slightly different names, but we're not actually changing anything. We should by now be familiar with the fact that they like using multiple terms to mean the same things. And while we're talking about consequences, I wanted to take a moment and talk about differential consequences. So the concept of sort of differential just means different. And when I talk about our chickadees in a little while, a couple of days, I'll also talk about differential reinforcement and things like that. And all it means is that you get sort of different outcomes or different things happening. So when we talk about differential consequences, we're saying that the consequences will change depending on a situation. So we have a setup here where maybe someone's working with children and they want them to learn the difference between a file and a clip. So they'll ask them to give them a file. And if the child picks up the file, then the experimenter will give the child a chip. If the experimenter asks for the clip and the child picks up a clip, then they'll get a cookie. Both are good outcomes for the child, so they would be more likely to pick up the correct thing. But strangely, having these different consequences makes the process easier to learn, because they can sort of make that association of the antecedent of being asked for a file, the behavior of picking up a file, and the consequence of getting a chip are separate and don't overlap with the antecedent of being asked for a clip, the response or the behavior of picking up a clip, and the outcome or consequence of getting a cookie. Those are treated separately, and it leads to faster learning. Whereas if we look at the example on the bottom, there's the same basic idea, but they were asking for two different things. But here, no matter what they ask for, if the child does it right, they get a raisin every single time. And because of that overlap, where they both have the same consequence or outcome, that actually leads to slower learning. So having these differential consequences, having them separated out, can help us learn things faster. And I'm sure they accounted for the fact that not everybody loves raisins or chips or cookies. Usually when you run these, you'll test preferences first so that nobody's sort of biased. It wasn't just the fact that everybody hates raisins and they just didn't do well for that reason. But this is a good example showing that that difference in consequences can change how quickly we learn. Okay, so our next concept is to talk about reinforcement contingencies. And so first I wanted to explain what a contingency is. So this is like an if-then logic rule. So we say that if you do this behavior, then that consequence will happen. So we're specifying the rules of what outcome will follow a particular behavior. So if you've done any kind of coding or anything that relies on logic, if-then rules are pretty standard. But for those who are not super familiar with it, we're just setting up how the situation exists. And so we can have two broad categories. We're going to look at a couple of different things and then we're going to combine them. But the first big difference is we can have things that are reinforcement or things that we classify as punishment. Reinforcement is any outcome that strengthens the probability of a response. So when we talked about a rat pushing a lever and getting food, that strengthens the response. So that would be an instance of reinforcement because now they're more likely to push that lever in the future because the outcome was good. For punishment, this is any outcome that weakens the probability of response. And this one's a little bit harder because we have a preconceived notion of what punishment means to us in society. But for learning, punishment simply is stating that we are less likely to perform a particular action or behavior because of that outcome. So if the rat pushes the lever and the lights turn out, they don't get food, it just gets dark, that's not a good outcome, so they're probably less likely to push the lever. They don't want to be in the dark anymore. So we would call that punishment, even if it doesn't fit what you think of as punishment just from your definition of the word. So this is one of those where the learning definition's a little bit different. Okay, so that's reinforcement and punishment. That's are we increasing or decreasing the probability of the behavior. But now we can also add another dimension, and this is positive or negative. And again, this is separate from, say, our preconceived notions. We might think of punishment as a negative thing, but that's not always the case with learning. When we're talking about positive or negative, all we care about is, are we adding or subtracting a stimulus? Is our consequence something that's being introduced, or is it something that's being taken away? And this will make more sense as we start combining things. I'm going to give you examples of each of our 4 possible overlaps here, just so that you know what's going on. All right, so let's start with positive reinforcement. So we've said that positive means that we're applying a stimulus. Some kind of event is being introduced, we're adding something to the situation. Reinforcement means that we're increasing the frequency of the desired behavior. So we are giving them something that makes them more likely to do the behavior in the future. Okay, so the rat pushes the lever and gets food. They are doing an action, it leads to them getting something, and they're more likely to press the lever again in the future. That fulfills all of those needs. Okay, how about positive punishment? This is what most people think of in terms of punishment outside of learning, but we're going to do the definition the same way. So positive meaning that we're applying some kind of stimulus, we're adding something to the situation. Punishment means that we're adding something that decreases the frequency of an undesirable behavior. So if you swear in front of your parent and they yell at you, that's an applied stimulus of yelling or scolding or however. They're adding something and you are less likely to swear in front of that parent in the future. So that would be positive punishment. But what about negatives? This is where it gets a little bit mind-bending. So negatives, we're removing stimuli. We're taking stuff out of the situation. So negative reinforcement, we're taking something away that makes us more likely to do that behavior in the future. Okay, so let's say that you have a headache and your head hurting is a bad thing. If you take Advil, then that pain will go away. So we're doing something, we're removing that pain, and you're going to feel better. That's going to make you more likely to take Advil in the future when you have a headache. So we can call that antecedent our having a headache. The behavior or the response would be to take an Advil. And the outcome is that it gets rid of that bad thing that was happening, the pain in your head. And then the last one is negative punishment. So we're removing something and decreasing the frequency of undesirable behavior. So this would be like a timeout. So if a child throws a toy and they're not supposed to, so then the parent takes that toy away. So the parent is removing something, they're taking away a toy that the child likes, and the outcome should be that the child is less likely to throw their toy in the future. So a reduction of that unwanted behavior in the future. So with these, I would focus on breaking the situations down each time. Are we adding or removing something? Are they more or less likely to perform the behavior in the future? Because there is always going to be at least one or two of these questions on testing materials. So it's a good idea to be able to tell them apart. And the textbooks always give a bunch of different examples for these, so that would be a good place to start if it hasn't quite sunk in yet. But we'll be using these terms sort of as we go forward. But before we continue too far on, I'm actually going to add one extra layer to it. And our negative reinforcement, where we are taking away something that was bad to make us more likely to do something in the future, we can actually break that down even further. So we can break our negative reinforcement down into escape and avoidance behavior. So here, escape behavior is just what we had talked about for negative reinforcement, nothing fancy. Escape behavior is the standard out-of-the-box negative reinforcement, where you perform a particular behavior to terminate or stop an aversive stimulus that is happening. You take an Advil so that your headache goes away. So in this case, we focus on the fact that the aversive stimulus is occurring, and you're going to do a behavior to make it stop occurring. Now when it gets cool is to bring in avoidance behavior. And this is where you perform a behavior that prevents the aversive stimulus from ever occurring. So this involves a little bit more complex learning. You actually have to learn how to predict when a bad behavior is going to come. So maybe you've checked the weather and you know that it's supposed to be really high pressure and it's going to rain tomorrow, and you always get a headache when it rains. So maybe you're going to take preventative Advil before you go out for the day so that you don't get a headache. That would be avoidance behavior because you're doing an action so that you don't have to deal with that aversive stimulus occurring at any point. So with our learning, maybe we have a signal that lets us know that something bad is coming. And we know that we could do something to stop it from happening. Usually within operant setups, we'll have what's called a shuttle box, which is kind of like two operant chambers up against one another, and you can move between the two of them. One of them would have a signal that says, hey, we're going to play a really loud sound, or we're going to electrify the floor so that you get a little bit of a shock, or we're going to turn the lights out. And that's on one side. And if the animal learns what that sort of warning signal means, they can head into the other box and avoid any of those bad things that might be happening. So it's really neat to watch in those shuttle boxes that movement from one side to the other to avoid things that have happened. But that involves extra learning because we need to learn that that warning signal is telling us what's coming. So it's almost like a combination of our classical conditioning, where we have to associate that warning signal with the bad thing, and operant conditioning, where once we know that, we can then perform a behavior to avoid the bad thing. So just an extra step added in there. And for those who are visual, we can break it down like this, where we have sort of reinforcement versus punishment, positive and negative, and then we break down our negative reinforcement into escape and avoidance. So this is just a nice, convenient diagram that I found and could be helpful when deciding if a particular situation is describing positive or negative punishment or reinforcement. Okay, so those are a bunch of different options, but this is usually the point where we sit down and say, okay, out of all of these, which one is the best? Which one is our preferred action? What should we use? And the answer is it depends on your situation. Most of the time, we're going to prefer to use reinforcement. So reinforcement works in that you're encouraging a desired behavior. You're telling them to do more of the thing that we want you to do. And reinforcement doesn't come with some of the ethical gray areas that we can get with punishment as well. And I'll delve into that in just a second. But with reinforcement, and especially positive reinforcement, people love to get things, to be given sort of encouragement in order to keep doing something. There's no involvement of negatives or anything like that. So positive reinforcement is kind of an all-around decent setup. And it tells us what we should be doing. So it's focusing us in on what's desirable, and there's no need to focus on the negatives. It's also especially useful because with positive reinforcement, you don't have to reinforce every single time. And when we start talking about schedules of reinforcement, we'll actually realize that it's even better not to reinforce every single time. But if every once in a while you get your dog to sit and then you give him a cookie, he's going to want to sit more often. And even if sometimes he sits and doesn't get a cookie, it's not the end of the world. He's still going to sit the next time because one of those times he'll get a cookie. So we get a pretty good payout for that positive reinforcement. But we run into issues with punishment for a whole bunch of different reasons. So these are kind of a great summary of some of the biggest ones. The first is that punishment on its own only tells us what not to do. It doesn't tell us what we should be doing instead. So we're not being told where to direct our efforts. So maybe a child is yelling and their parent gets mad at them, but they don't know what else to do to get their parent's attention. So what would be better would be if the parents encouraged an alternative behavior in order for them to do something productive instead of the behavior they don't want them to do. Punishment also usually involves aversive stimuli, so sometimes things that cause pain or startling or discomfort or any of those things. So especially for that reason, positive punishment is avoided as much as possible because the introduction of something bad is not a good thing. We also run into some issues outside of just the individual receiving the punishment. There's also the person who gives punishment. So if you think about it, a parent who positively punishes a child and sees a decrease in an undesirable behavior, that parent is actually being reinforced to do that behavior more themselves because they're getting the outcome that they wanted. So we see sort of this spiraling of they're more likely to use punishment in the future because it got them the desired outcome in the past. And there's a tendency for that to kind of spiral because it might require more intense punishment to get the desired outcome, and it kind of spirals out of control. That is a big thing. I actually spend an entire chapter talking about punishment in one of the learning classes that I do. So it's an issue. But that's what we'll say for now. We also see that those who are on the receiving end of punishment then see it as sort of a viable response. So if someone else has used punishment on them, they are likely to use punishment themselves to get the goals that they want. So especially with this looking at children, if they're on the receiving end of punishment, then they're more likely to dish that out to others. And then we have the issue where, so okay, there's all of those ethical things, there's all of those concerns, but there's also sort of the practicality of, with reinforcement, we can get away with not having to reinforce every single occurrence. But with punishment, we have to punish every single occurrence, and we should do it immediately so that that association is learned. And you have to do it with a large enough aversive stimulus that it actually affects them. So there's all sorts of things that you have to consider with punishment. So not only is it ethically dubious, but it's practically difficult as well. So this is why most of the time we're going to stick with reinforcement. And specifically, a lot of the stuff we talk about is positive reinforcement because that's the easiest to study, especially in those operant boxes we were talking about. So that's just sort of a why we don't use punishment. All right. Next thing I want to talk about are two sort of related concepts. And this is the concept of shaping and chaining. So we've talked about having these rats in a box that press a lever. But it might have occurred to you that rats don't naturally press levers. That's not a behavior that they just spontaneously do. Or the same with our chickadees in operant boxes. They typically don't fly into strange man-made contraptions in order to produce a response. So how do we get these animals to do these strange tasks? Well, that process is called shaping. So through shaping, you would reinforce what are called successive approximations towards some final response. So what this means is if you want the rat to press a lever, the first thing that you do is reinforce something kind of like pressing the lever. So maybe you start with when the rat is facing the lever, they get food. And then once they face the lever pretty consistently, you say, okay, now you don't get food for just facing it. Now you have to approach it. Okay, now you approach it, you only get food if you touch it. And now that you touch it, you only get food if you press it. So that's reinforcing each of those baby steps towards our final desired goal, and specifically no longer reinforcing those previous approximations. So we're going to get them to shift their behavior towards what we want them to do. With our chickadees, we spend 2 to 3 weeks teaching them just how to use the apparatus so that we know that they know what they're doing. With things like lever pressing, it might be a little bit faster. So this process allows us to get them to do behaviors that they wouldn't naturally do. We can kind of nudge their behavior in a particular way. Another process that we can use to sort of build up more complex behaviors is the process called chaining. And in this case, you'd have sort of an existing response, and then instead of delivering that reinforcement after they complete their first response, you would give them the opportunity to perform another response. So the only way that they can get food is if they press a lever and then press it again. Or maybe you have 2 levers, one on opposite sides of the room. And so pressing the first lever doesn't do anything. But if they press the first one and then press the second one, then they get their reinforcement. So you can string together or chain together these different responses in order to get more and more complex behaviors. You see a lot of this when you look at, say, people who train their pets to do really complex actions. So there's a video of a rat that learns how to sort of drag a ladder up an incline and then use it to go get food. And so they move the ladder across 3 different platforms and then eventually go and get the food. And they could only do that if they do all of the steps in between because they need the ladder where it ends up. So chaining is just our way of stringing together these more complex actions or these simple actions into one more complex overall occurrence. And so when we're looking at humans, and sometimes with other species, we typically use some kind of combination of sort of shaping, but also, if we can, instructions or even demonstrations where we show them how to be doing it in order to get them from one part to another to doing the behavior that we want them to do. It's a lot easier with humans, especially if we can give verbal instructions. That tends to cut out a lot of our in-betweens. All right, and let me just double check what we have left here. I think I'm going to leave us there for today. We should be able to wrap this up next class, and then we'll move on into our social learning in that next class as well. So we should be able to finish both of these, and then that'll still leave us with sort of practicality and applying it on Friday.